The experimental UES Dauntless unleashed a barrage of devastating plasma torpedoes, the deadly projectiles ripping through the hulls of the attacking Saurian warships like buckshot through tin foil. Captain Brian Porter gripped the armrests of his command chair, his knuckles white as he watched the carnage unfold on the view screen. Just minutes ago, he and his crew had been preparing to run field tests on the Dauntless' advanced weapons and propulsion systems. Now, they were the only thing standing between the defenseless colony of New Horizons and total annihilation at the hands of the ruthless Saurian warlord Xenos. Porter had pushed for years to get the Dauntless built, pouring his heart and soul into the project. He had faced endless skepticism, budget cuts, and bureaucratic roadblocks, but he never lost sight of his vision for a revolutionary new class of battleship that could project human power to the farthest reaches of space. When the Dauntless finally launched, Porter thought he would be taking his ship on a shakedown cruise, not a suicide mission. But as soon as the Saurian fleet dropped out of hyperspace and began raining plasma bombs on the unsuspecting colonists, he knew there was no choice. The Dauntless had to fight, ready or not. As the distance closed between the Dauntless and the attacking Saurian ships, Vok, Porter's reptilian tactical officer, called out an urgent warning. "Captain, I'm detecting 48 signatures inbound. The Saurians have us outnumbered and outgunned 10-1. Our shields are already at 50% and falling fast." Porter felt a cold knot of fear in his gut, but he pushed it aside. The colonists were depending on him, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. "Divert all power to weapons and engines," Porter barked. "Helm, set an intercept course. We'll hit them with everything we've got and buy time for the colony to evacuate." The bridge crew scrambled to carry out his orders as the ship shuddered under another wave of plasma impacts. On the view screen, Porter watched helplessly as the orbital defense platforms the colony had spent decades building were shredded like tissue paper under the onslaught of the Saurian bombardment. He knew that every second he delayed, more innocent lives were lost. It all came down to this moment, a desperate battle against impossible odds. Porter closed his eyes for a split second, the faces of his crew flashing through his mind. They were the best of the best, handpicked for their skills and courage. He owed it to them, and to the thousands of colonists below, to make their sacrifice mean something. With a final nod to his first officer, Porter gave the order to attack. The Dauntless surged forward, the ion engines howling as a volley of plasma torpedoes leaped from the launch tubes. This was it, the moment of truth. All of human space was watching to see if Porter's experimental ship could live up to its name, or if it would burn along with the colony it was supposed to save. The Dauntless surged forward, engines screaming as it closed the distance to the Saurian fleet. Captain Porter leaned forward in his chair, eyes locked on the tactical display. "Railguns 1 and 2, fire on my mark. Plasma cannons, stand by for coordinated volley." The crew responded with precision, born of endless drills, their hands flying over consoles. Lieutenant Commander Reeves, the tactical officer, targeted the lead Saurian cruiser. "Railgun 1 locked on enemy cruiser's engines. Railgun 2 locked on command bridge. Plasma cannons locked on weapon hardpoints." Porter nodded. "Fire!" The Dauntless shuddered as the experimental weapons roared to life. Twin railgun slugs, each weighing 250 kilograms, shot out at a fraction of light speed. Accelerated by powerful magnetic fields, they crossed the vast distance in heartbeats, smashing into the Saurian shields with cataclysmic force. The alien shields flared, flickered, and died under the onslaught. The slugs tore into the ship's hull, eviscerating the engine block and command bridge. Atmosphere and debris geysered from the gaping wounds. Before the stricken cruiser could react, a dozen plasma bolts streaked out from the Dauntless, unerringly finding the ship's exposed weapon mounts. The cruiser shuddered as secondary explosions rippled across its hull. It listed drunkenly, engines dead, weapons silent. On the bridge of his flagship, Warlord Xenos watched in stunned disbelief as his vanguard crumpled under the Dauntless's fire. The human ship was an insignificant gnat against his mighty armada. Yet that gnat had just crippled one of his cruisers in seconds. "Impossible," he hissed. "No human weapon has such range or power. All ships, concentrate fire on that human vessel. I want it destroyed." The Saurian fleet wheeled ponderously, bringing their weapons to bear on the Dauntless. Plasma bolts and laser beams crisscrossed the void, slamming into the Dauntless shields with brutal force. On the bridge, warning sirens blared as the shield status dropped precipitously. "Shields at 20%, Reeves shouted over the cacophony. "They're focusing fire on our weakened rear quadrant." Porter clutched his armrests as the ship bucked and heaved under the barrage. They couldn't take much more of this, but they had to hold out. The colonists were depending on them. "Cycle the shields," he ordered. "Divert power from non-essential systems to the aft generators, and keep firing, damn it! We have to thin their ranks." The crew worked frantically, rerouting power, coaxing every erg of energy into the faltering shields. The railguns continued their deadly work, each shot claiming an enemy ship. The plasma cannons fired non-stop, wreaking havoc among the Saurian fleet. But it wasn't enough. The Saurians kept coming, their weapons pounding the Dauntless's shields, chipping away at the ship's defenses. Porter watched helplessly as the shield status ticked downward. 15%, 12%, 8%. Suddenly, Reeves straightened at his console, eyes widening. "Captain, I'm detecting a fluctuation in the Saurian flagship's shield harmonics. I think our weapons might be able to breach it at these coordinates." Porter leaned forward, studying the tactical display. The flagship loomed in the center of the Saurian formation, a behemoth overflowing with weapons. If they could take it out... "Are you sure, Jack?" Reeves met his gaze, tenacity etched on his face. "As sure as I can be, sir. It's a small window, but if we hit it with everything we've got..." Porter made his decision. "Helm, bring us about. Line us up for a clear shot at the flagship. Divert all power to weapons and forward shields." As the crew scrambled to obey, Porter keyed the ship-wide comm. "All hands, this is the captain. We're going for the flagship. If we can take it out, we might just win this thing. But it's going to get rough. Brace for impact and hold tight. Porter out." The Dauntless swung around, engines flaring as it accelerated towards the Saurian flagship. The enemy ships intensified their fire, plasma bolts hammering the Dauntless shields like hail on a tin roof. The bridge shook violently, sparks cascading from overloaded consoles. The shield status plummeted to 5%, 3%. "Weapon status," Porter shouted. "Railguns ready," Reeves replied. His face was cut and bleeding, but his voice was steady. "Plasma cannons fully charged, ready to fire on your command." Porter nodded. "Aim for those shield coordinates. Fire." The Dauntless shuddered as though struck by a giant hammer. The railguns unleashed their payload, the hypersonic slugs blurring as they shot towards the flagship. A heartbeat later, the plasma cannons fired, a blinding torrent of sun-hot plasma following in the railgun's wake. The flagship's shields flared incandescently as they tried to repel the onslaught. For a moment, it looked like they might hold, but then, at the point Reeves had identified, the shield wavered and collapsed. The railgun slugs and plasma bolts slammed into the ship's hull, crushing armor and vaporizing bulkheads. For a moment, the flagship hung motionless, gaping holes torn in its sides. Then, with a silent flash, it detonated. A miniature sun bloomed where the flagship had been, consuming the ship and its crew in an instant of blazing light. The shockwave rippled outward, crumpling nearby Saurian ships like empty cans. On the Dauntless's bridge, the crew erupted in cheers. Against adversity, they had done it. They had destroyed the flagship and broken the back of the Saurian fleet. The few remaining enemy ships, leaderless and demoralized, broke off and fled, vanishing into hyperspace. "Stand down from battle stations," Porter said, his voice hoarse. "Damage report." The reports flooded in. The Dauntless was battered and scarred, its shields depleted, its hull breached in a dozen places. Scores of crew were dead or wounded. But the ship was still flying, and the immediate threat was over. Porter slumped back in his chair, exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. They had won, but the cost had been high, too high, and he knew this was just the beginning. Already, rescue ships from nearby colonies were approaching, ready to help evacuate the wounded and begin the long process of rebuilding. And beyond that, Porter knew, the repercussions of this battle would be felt across the galaxy. The Dauntless had proven the power of its experimental weapons, showing that humanity was no longer content to cower before alien threats. Other species, the Saurians included, would be scrambling to match this sudden leap in human technology. A new arms race had begun, and humanity had fired the starting gun. For better or worse, the balance of power had shifted, and Captain Brian Porter and the UES Dauntless would be at the forefront of the coming storm, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The celebrations on the Dauntless's bridge were short-lived. As the adrenaline of victory faded, the true cost of their triumph became apparent. Warning klaxons blared throughout the ship, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. "Status report," Porter called out, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the battle. Lieutenant Commander Reeves's fingers flew over his console. "Captain, we're in bad shape. Reactors are barely holding at 40% capacity. Life support is failing on decks 3 through 7. Maneuvering thrusters are completely shot." Porter's stomach dropped as Reeves continued, his voice cracking. "Sir, we've got a major breach in engineering. 24 crew, including Chief Collins. They're gone." The bridge fell silent, the weight of loss settling heavily on everyone's shoulders. Porter closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief second to mourn before snapping back into action. "All right, people, we're not out of this yet. Reeves, coordinate with the incoming rescue ships. Get our wounded off first. Engineering teams, focus on life support and containment around that breach. We need to keep this ship together." As the crew scrambled to carry out his orders, Porter moved from station to station, offering words of encouragement and lending a hand where needed. The ship groaned and creaked around them, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to total destruction. Hours passed in a blur of emergency repairs and rescue operations. Just as it seemed they might be getting a handle on the situation, Reeves called out from his station, his voice tight with fear. "Captain, long-range sensors are picking up something. Oh God." Porter rushed to Reeves's side, his eyes widening as he took in the sensor readings. A massive Saurian fleet, dwarfing the force they'd just defeated, was bearing down on New Horizons. "How many ships?" Porter asked, dreading the answer. "At least 3 times what we faced before," Reeves replied. "And these aren't just frigates and escorts. I'm counting multiple dreadnoughts and heavy capital ships." Porter's mind raced. This was no retaliatory strike. This was a full-scale invasion force, likely sent by Saurian High Command to finish what Xenos had started. "They must have been waiting in reserve," Porter muttered, ready to swoop in and claim New Horizons after Xenos softened us up. He looked around the battered bridge, at his exhausted crew and their crippled ship. They were all that stood between the colony and utter annihilation. "All right, we can't take them head on, not like this," Porter declared. "But we're not abandoning those colonists. Helm, how's our maneuverability?" "Non-existent, sir," came the grim reply. Porter nodded, an idea forming. "Then we'll make ourselves maneuverable. All hands, prepare for emergency separation protocols. We're ditching the engineering section and any non-critical mass." A chorus of surprised voices filled the bridge, but Porter silenced them with a raised hand. "I know it's extreme, but it's our only shot. Once we've shed the extra weight, we'll lure that fleet into the asteroid belt. Use our speed and agility to our advantage." As the crew rushed to enact Porter's desperate plan, the view screens lit up with images of the approaching Saurian armada. Ship after ship dropped out of hyperspace, their weapons already charging. Porter gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles tightening. "Hold on, people," he said quietly. "This is going to get rough." The Dauntless shuddered as separation charges detonated, jettisoning huge sections of the ship into space. What remained was little more than the bridge, weapons systems, and a skeleton of their former glory. but they were lighter, faster. As the Saurian fleet drew ever closer, Porter knew they were in for the fight of their lives. But as he looked at the determined faces of his crew, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. They'd beaten the odds once today. Now they'd have to do it again, for the sake of every soul on New Horizons. The Dauntless limped through space, her once proud hull now a patchwork of scars and gaping wounds. Captain Porter stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the flickering holographic display of New Horizons. The colony, a fragile bubble of life amid the void, grew steadily larger as they approached. "Status report," Porter called out, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting orders. Lieutenant Commander Reeves looked up from his console, his face smeared with grime and sweat. "Hull integrity critical, sir. We're venting atmosphere on decks 3 through 7. Reactor containment is unstable." Porter nodded grimly. They'd won the battle, but at a terrible cost. He keyed the shipwide comm. "All hands, prepare for emergency evacuation. This is not a drill." As the crew scrambled to obey, a priority message flashed on the main screen. Porter's heart sank as he read the text. He turned to Reeves. "Rescue shuttles can't dock. Our hull's too compromised." Reeves's eyes widened. "But, sir, how will we—" "Thruster-propelled rescue pods," Porter cut him off. "It's our only option. Get it done." The next hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Porter stood in the hangar bay, overseeing the evacuation. Crew members streamed past, helping the wounded into the cramped rescue pods. Dr. Kempton moved among them, his medical bag clutched tight as he tended to the most critical cases. "Easy now," Kempton murmured, easing a badly burned ensign into a pod. "You'll be all right, son. Just hold on a little longer." Porter felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Reeves. The lieutenant commander's face was grim. "Captain, a word?" They stepped aside and Reeves lowered his voice. "Sir, damage control projections are not good. The reactor containment is failing. If it goes while we're near the colony—" Porter closed his eyes, the weight of command pressing down on him. When he opened them, his decision was made. "We can't risk it. Once the crew's evacuated, we'll take her out, far enough that the detonation won't threaten New Horizons." Reeves nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. "I'll stay with you, sir. We'll need a skeleton crew to pilot her out." Porter clasped his shoulder. "Thank you, Jack. Put out the call for volunteers. But make it clear, this is a one-way trip." As the last of the crew were loaded into the rescue pods, Porter addressed the remaining volunteers, his iron crew. Graves, the ever-reliable helmsman. Kempton, who'd refused to leave his patients. Chief Mitchell, whose expertise might buy them precious minutes with the failing reactor. "Gentlemen," Porter said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. "What we do here today will save countless lives. It has been my greatest honor to serve with you." They made their way to the Combat Operations Center, a room now filled with sparking consoles and the acrid smell of burnt circuitry. As each man took his station, Porter opened a channel to the departing rescue pods. "Godspeed," he said simply, watching as the last of the tiny craft vanished into the star-speckled black. Porter settled into the captain's chair one final time. "Helm, set course bearing 220 Mark 15, maximum sustainable thrust." The Dauntless shuddered as her engines fired, driving her away from the glowing orb of New Horizons. On the console, the colony dwindled, becoming just another point of light among billions. As alarms blared warning of the reactor's imminent failure, Porter allowed himself a moment of reflection. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd saved the colony and struck a blow for humanity's place among the stars. He keyed in the final transmission to UES Command, his voice steady as he recounted their victory and their sacrifice. As the message concluded, Porter looked around at his iron crew, men who'd volunteered to die so others might live. "It's been an honor," he said simply. They nodded, no more words needed between them. The reactor's scream reached a fever pitch, and Porter watched as cracks spread across the view screen, starlight bleeding through. In that final moment, as the Dauntless's hull began to split apart, Porter thought he glimpsed the future they'd won for humanity, a future of hope, of courage, of endless possibility among the stars.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.